Hello and welcome to the Franchise Tag Podcast with me, your host, Freddie Hall. I'm joined once again by Andrew and Adam. This time we're all back together. Make sure you like and subscribe all our videos on YouTube and our YouTube channel. Go and subscribe to that. Thank you for all the support so far. We've had over 100 views on our last video about Jamar Chase, which we're really proud of, and even more proud of the Zach Wilson New York Jets one, nearly up to 500 views on there. We can't believe that Zach Wilson and the Jets got so many people to go and have a look at it on YouTube, but that's really kind of you. You know, we're all very new to this, so the more we do it, the more fun it'll be. Hopefully, the more following it'll build. But again, thank you for everyone who's supporting us so far. Really good talk with another Matt. We have Matt with us now, but we had another Matt on. We was talking about Penei Sewell going to the Detroit Lions. But now we have Matthew on with us today. He's the lead writer and DFS analyst for the Fantasy Footballers podcast over in America. Matthew, I hope you're well. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us as well. I hope you've had a decent year so far, considering what has happened.
Yeah, I would say this year is better than last year already, hands down. No matter what happens, we're already there. So yeah, I'm really excited to join you guys today and to talk Jaycee Horn and to talk the Carolina Panthers. So really appreciate you guys having me on. Hopefully you guys are having a good year too. It sounds like the YouTube channel is off to a good start. So let's keep it rolling for you here in 2021.
Yeah, it's getting there. We're slowly getting there. We're slowly adapting. We were camera shy at first, but now we're getting a bit more used to the camera, used to how it all works. But the difference between maybe this episode to a lot of episodes we've done is you aren't necessarily a specific Carolina Panthers fan, but you are an incredible, you have incredible NFL knowledge and lots to talk about with Jaycee Horn, the 21-year-old from Georgia who went to South Carolina College. A pick that maybe we didn't see coming with the Carolina Panthers, Matthew. What was your reaction when his name got called out, Jaycee Horn, and he becomes a Panther player? Because not all of us were convinced that was the route that they were going to go.
Yeah, I think you saw a lot of mocks where, Penei Sewell was falling to them. They had a couple defenders that not named Jaycee Horn mocked. But if you follow the NFL draft closely, you could hear the buzz around Jaycee Horn got really strong as the month progressed towards late April. And the reason for that was he just crushed his pro day. I mean, he came out and had stupid numbers that he put up from his athletic testing measurements here. 33-inch arms, 93rd percentile. Ran a 4.4 40. The broad jump was 96th percentile, as was his vertical. So you have this kind of hype that comes out with these players every season around the NFL draft, and teams just kind of fall in love with them and in hopes that they fit their scheme. And I think for, Jaycee Horn, we'll talk about his tape in a second, but he really just jumped up extremely in the NFL draft circles. A lot of hype around him, just given his pro day results, absolutely knocked out of the park.
Yeah, definitely. You've just touched on there that his pro day was so good. He did sort of quiet a lot of doubters with the stats that he put up, saying like some of his weaknesses, and then he just went, no, look what I can do. But also, I think, from the time that he had with South Carolina, what impressed you the most? I know you just said about watching the tape. What impressed you the most with his time with them?
Yeah, if you watch him play, there's one thing that sticks out after like every play he makes, which I like this in a defender and a guy that's supposed to be a stud cornerback that can lock down an opposing team's wide receiver one. And it's just his ability to kind of knock you off your game. If you watch him after every play, he's kind of talking to the opposing wide receiver. He's got that moxie to him, that swagger that you want to see a guy have confidence in it. If you're taking a guy in the top 10 of the NFL draft, he should be able to take away your team's wide receiver one or the opponent's wide receiver one, really. Play after play after play. And that's what you saw from him in 3 years starting at South Carolina. Physical, ability to play tight off the line of scrimmage in man-to-man coverage. Press coverage is really where he succeeded a lot during his time in college. And you could see that, they were able to scheme up the defense basically to say like, okay, JC's on this side, we're good, we'll figure everything out sort of thing. And we'll see if that translates to the NFL. But that's the kind of guy you want to be able to kind of lock down a team's opposing wide receiver one, with your cornerback one. And I think that the Carolina Panthers are telling us, yeah, Jaycee Horn can be that guy here moving forward.
I mean, yeah, sorry. I was just going to say we've also had a few of the college players come out that went up against him say that he was the hardest player to go up against in their time, which surprised me. I didn't watch a lot of South Carolina because not being the biggest SEC team, but listening to the players saying he was the toughest person they matched up against is a good tick for him.
For sure. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I would say most of the time you hear players kind of talk about that, and I feel like that's like what we need to take away most of this, right? It's like you just listen to people that play against this player every Saturday in college. They're going to tell you everything you need to know, right? You hear it all the time with guys in the NFL as well. This player is so difficult to play against. I do put a lot of stock into that. I agree with you. I heard a lot of those reports as well. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense.
Do you think that he's going to be someone who's going to integrate really well into the NFL? And also, at Carolina, you've got Matt Rule there. I mean, a really good college coach. Do you think that he's the guy who will be able to really make him stand out?
I do think it's a really good fit for Carolina, because when you look at their team as a whole, Matt Rule goes from the college ranks, like you said. He goes from Temple, turns that program around to actually be a winning team, winning program. Goes to Baylor. That team was left for dead in the Big 12. No one wanted to play for Baylor. They brought them back up to relevance. Goes to Carolina. Everyone said this is going to be a bottom 2 team. This team's going to be awful. I mean, they were still not great, but this is going to be the laughing stock of the NFL. And on the defensive side, where they took literally in 2019, the 2020 draft, they took every single player in the seven rounds they had. Every player was a defensive pick. So they had one of the youngest starting rosters in the NFL. And they actually held up pretty well. If you look at the data and you look at their numbers, it's not amazing, right? Like, the defense clearly wasn't great, but compared to the talent that they had and how young they were, you have to be really excited about what they're building there. So I think Matt Rule is a great coach. I think his system's going to fit Jaycee Horn really well, and vice versa. Like I said, they have a really good situation now. They brought in AJ Boye in free agency. Now you take Jaycee Horn to kind of lock down your cornerback 1 and cornerback 2 positions. And I think it fits really well. And you look at the entire defense as a whole, who they play against every single week as the opponent's wide receiver 1, right? The NFC South. We're talking Calvin Ridley, maybe Julio Jones if he doesn't get traded. We'll see. But Calvin Ridley in Atlanta, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans in Tampa, and oh, by the way, Michael Thomas, right, in New Orleans. Like, those are the wide receiver 1s in this division. You have to have stud corners to be able to keep up with them. So I like Matt Rule and what he's doing there, and I think Jaycee Horn's a great fit.
Yeah, I briefly spoke before I mentioned his strengths, about him having a lot of doubters. So with that, what do you think his weaknesses were, and what do you think his challenges are going to be with the Panthers this year?
Yeah, for sure. One thing that kind of, it sort of, it doesn't really make a ton of sense, because it's also his strength, but it's also his weakness. And that basically is his hands. Like, he's pretty good at hand fighting. He's really physical, but you can see at times, like, he doesn't really trust his technique when he gets beat off the line of scrimmage, which doesn't happen often, but when it does, he sort of uses his hands to kind of catch up to you and sort of make up for his mistakes, so to speak. And I can just see that at the NFL level turning into potentially a lot more flags than what we saw in college. So that's one thing to watch out for with him. The other thing is that he definitely thrived a lot more in man coverage versus zone. So depending on what scheme they're going to dial up there in Carolina, he may have a little bit of a learning curve there in zone coverage. But I think, looking at the NFL and looking at how players progress, like, man-to-man coverage, it doesn't change a lot from high school to college NFL. You're playing one player and trying to follow them around the field and play defense. The zone is sort of a little more complex. So I could see there being a little learning curve there for him in that aspect. But, he's top 10 pick. We're obviously nitpicking here with how good of a player he is.
The difference being that the guys are just a little bit stronger, just a little bit faster, and that little bit more experience that they have. But you're right. When you said about the hands thing, I watched some tape earlier. Someone was going over the top of it. And it was, from what I could tell, someone who's not really a tape person, I'm not a massive analyst, I don't go into depth on these things with college players, is that it was all teachable. It's all things that he can be taught. It's not stuff that, it's almost like bad habit that he will have to try and get himself out of. But do you think it's fair that these are all things that he can just be taught, and especially by a talented college coach like Matt Rule?
The other thing is that obviously, as we've been saying, when it comes to, they did draft a defensive player every single time last year in every round. I mean, do we really feel that a corner was what they desperately needed? I mean, I know that you came out and mentioned about the wide receivers that they're playing against, but it does feel like it might not necessarily have been the most important upgrade for them.
Yeah, I think you can make an argument. They obviously had a bunch of other holes to fill. Looking at what they did 2 years ago in the draft, they spent a lot of draft capital on the defensive side of the ball, and specifically in the trenches, like taking Gross Matos out of Penn State. They took Derek Brown out of Auburn, Ben Burns a couple years ago from Florida State. Like, they clearly invested a lot of youth and assets into the defensive line. So I think what they're doing with this pick is saying, like, listen, we invested a lot into the defensive line, into the pass rush, which was bottom 10 in the NFL last year. That's still an area of weakness for this team. And saying, they're young, hope that they can kind of get their act together there and kind of turn it around. And in the meantime, like, there's such a good, like, symbiotic relationship between what happens in terms of secondary coverage and the ability to buy time for the pass rushers to get to the quarterback. So when you upgrade your secondary, you can upgrade your pass rush, and vice versa, honestly, because you kind of have that, you've heard the term, I'm sure, like coverage sacks. You hear that all the time. Like, these guys that just, the quarterbacks don't know where to go, so they have to sit in the pocket. Guys can get after the quarterback. So I think it's going to help out the pass rush a lot, which was this team's really major area of weakness. But yeah, bringing in AJ Boye definitely helps. But looking at their cornerback too from last year, Troy Pride Jr., he got beat up last year. It was rough. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pro Football Focus. They grade player performance on a season-long basis, right? He was 137th in the NFL last year in terms of their grade. He allowed a 75% completion percentage when in coverage last year, which is not great. So I think there was definitely an area upgrade to the cornerback 2 position. And I think you immediately inject Jaycee Horn into this defense with AJ Boye as the cornerback 1. It's a really strong cornerback 1-2 pairing, in my opinion.
I guess the only, sorry, Fred.
No, go ahead, you go.
I guess the only reason I say it is that one thing that has been leveled at Carolina is the fact that they haven't replaced Luke Kuechly, and that sort of strong linebacker. And Micah Parsons was there. They could have taken him. So, whether you almost feel like someone like him would have been a better choice for them when it comes to the defense.
Yeah, it could have been. I mean, that's definitely a good argument. Luke Kuechly was like, he's such the face of the franchise type of player. But it's actually really ironic. Like, when you look at advanced data, the advanced analytics behind football, which is just becoming so much more popular, it's showing that linebacker play doesn't actually have a lot of weight on how your team performs. I mean, obviously you don't want just dudes out there, random guys, but you need people that are talented and smart. But when you look at kind of the elite of the elite versus, middle of the road type linebackers, it doesn't have a lot of value. And the term that we generally report of that is kind of like wins above replacement. It doesn't change or tip the scales for you as much. So I do think having linebackers that can play in coverage, that are athletic, that can get on, these Travis Kelce's and Darren Waller's at tight end, et cetera, is really important. But kind of looking at the ability to take away wide receiver play has been trying to be a little more predictive. So I think it just sort of depends on your defensive philosophy and, how much you trust analytics versus, the team sort of like makeup and the locker room sort of thing. So I could have seen them go either way. I will say I'm a Penn State fan. I got to see Micah Parsons play in person a couple of times. I would not have doubted anyone to take that dude. He was so good in person that we actually got to watch them play a game against Michigan. It was the whiteout game before the pandemic, so 2 years ago. And we were on the field for pregame warmups. I was like 5 feet from Micah Parsons. He is every bit of what he looks like on TV. He's absolutely massive.
It's good for you mentioned about locker room, because as soon as you said about linebacker and the analytics of it, I was thinking, well, Luke Kuechly, though, was like you said, the face of the franchise, and really the guy in the defense who was the captain. And he may analytically and data wise, he may not have made as important in plays as other players, but the impact he had on team as a leader and as a captain, as the face of the franchise. Do you think there is value? You talk about the data and the value of that. Do they outweigh each other? Does it in the NFL? Is it more that the data goes there, or is there still a strong argument to be made that this guy has the intangibles, I suppose, as a leader and as someone in the locker room?
Yeah, I think that's the tricky part, right? You have to have that balance. There's a lot of people that subscribe to just one thing or to just the other, and I think those are both wrong. You have to have the ability to kind of find both. And obviously, in an ideal scenario, you find players that fit both those, advanced metrics and advanced data that are also good people and good, locker room guys, so to speak. So I definitely think there's a balance for sure.
Because I think you could make the argument, this is really the next question, is that was it the right cornerback? It was the first cornerback off the board. Was it the right cornerback for them to take? Because Patrick Surtain was still there. I know Caleb Farley fell down the board due to his injury. There was some strong people in the second round. Obviously, Greg Newsome, Eric Stokes went in the first round. And Jaycee Horn is a very complete cornerback. And we all just really spoke about it at some points, is that his pro day was amazing. His attitude there was amazing. And I saw a video where he was a bit like, the NFL was not really ready for me. He'd been a bit of a hype man, a bit Jalen Ramsey-esque, I suppose. Was that maybe what? Goodness me, that shocked the life out of me. Grandma, quiet, leave me alone. I'm doing something. But is that maybe why the Panthers did take him cornerback one? Is yes, he's got the ability, the athleticism, the size. His pro day was fantastic, but actually his attitude, his drive, and maybe when they met him, his capability to go, yeah, I do these things wrong, but I am going to learn to change them. I'm going to break my bad habits of my hands and things like that. Do you think that maybe is why the Panthers did go for him as the first cornerback off the board?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, honestly, like I feel like these two players probably are coin flip, right? Like we'll know in a couple of years which one was the quote right pick. They could both be studs. But yeah, Patrick Surtain, I think, was kind of that guy that everyone just figured, okay, cornerback one, don't even think twice about it. But you see this most years in the NFL draft where these guys, they get scouted, these guys do their homework on them through and through. I mean, it's crazy the level of research they go into. So clearly somewhere along the way, they fell in love with Jaycee Horn over Surtain. And, we saw him go one pick later, right, to the Broncos right after it. So clearly they're both right there. They're in the same tier. To me, the same caliber of player. I wouldn't have faulted them at all to take Surtain. It's just these guys have these traits, or they fall in love with like their backgrounds, their stories, and they end up taking him. So we'll see if it's the right pick. I think you really could have gone either way, and it wouldn't have been a shock to anyone.
Before someone else asks a question, sorry to interrupt you. I'll say this, and one of you can ask a question. We're talking about what wide receivers he's played against. This is the list that I got earlier. This is insane. This is a bit boring. It's a bit longer. A.J. Brown, Kyle Pitts, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, Elijah Moore, De'Ami Brown, Justin Ross, Cordell Powell, Josh Palmer, Trevin Grimes, Van Jefferson, Tyree Cleveland, Terrace Marshall. Well, half of them are NFL number one wide receivers. I mean, this guy's prepped and ready to go for sure.
Are you trying to say that he should be pretty good?
I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that he should be pretty good.
Just sort of like moving away from Jaycee Horn as just like the main pick. I mean, how did you actually feel about the Panthers draft overall? Because they did bring in some decent players over during the course of the weekend.
Yeah, I thought they had a pretty strong draft. I like what they did. You talk about some franchises like the Raiders come to mind. Like, they make some picks and you're just like, what is happening? And with the Panthers, they didn't have any of those. So they're in the right ballpark, right? They're on target. Now, the NFL draft is so hit or miss. Like people treat it as if it's black and white, correct or wrong. And it's, it's set in stone. We see it every year. Like guys just flame out or they miss or off the field stuff or injury or whatever. So you just like to see them kind of identify where their weaknesses are and address them. I like the Terrace Marshall pick in the second round quite a bit. I think it was a huge value. We saw him fall a little bit with some medical concerns. I think those are personally overblown based off the research I've done, but I do think that he is a nice spark plug there to give Sam Darnold support to see if he can be the guy. I mean, you want to know if he's the guy, give him some weapons and find out. And you could argue, the three wide receiver set, DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, his former teammate, and now Terrace Marshall. There's a lot worse wide receiver rooms in the NFL than that. So I like that pick quite a bit in the second round.
Yeah, I had the Carolina Panthers down. We did a show about it, and I had them down as my favorite, and I thought they did the best out of the draft completely. I think that mainly when you look at it, Matt Rule has come from a college background. And I think that's really helped him when he's selecting these college guys, because obviously you get to see a lot of them. We spoke earlier saying how well he can take a college team to the next level. And yeah, I just thought he had a great view and knowledge of the strength of the positions in each round of the draft. Because originally I thought they'd go offensive line with the first pick and then just go offensive heavy all the way through. But then when you look at the second round, the third round, and the fourth round, even as far down as sort of like sixth round, they were still picking some big names. I just think they've strengthened wide receiver. I thought they got a great backup for Christian McCaffrey and Chuba Hubbard. So I think, yeah, it just screams volumes that maybe these college head coaches do have a better insight with what's going on with the players coming through.
I think it's a great point. I mean, you look at like, there's so many relationships in football of like, think about like Bill Belichick and Nick Saban, right? Like those two are just so close that like all these Alabama guys go to play for the Patriots. It's like who you trust and who's in your circle that can give you good information on these prospects. Matt Rule, not that long ago, was coaching in college, like you said. And so now he has all these guys that, you know, his former coaches are going on to coach elsewhere. He's come from different schools, et cetera. So I definitely think that's a huge factor for sure. I'm with you on that.
Is there, obviously you are a massive fantasy footballing man, as well as a regular NFL man. Is there anyone we need to keep an eye on with the Carolina Panthers to be drafting in regular redraft fantasy, or is there in Dynasty League someone we should be taking to keep hold of? We actually took in our own Dynasty League, which we're in with UK podcasters, Terrace Marshall in the second round, which we were all really thrilled to take. And we traded down. Did we trade down one? And we thought the guy in front was going to take a quarterback, and he took Trey Sermon. So and then we got Terrace Marshall with the second pick in the second round. Is Terrace Marshall someone you should be looking at redraft leagues as well, or is he someone we're going to have to sit on for a bit? What, in your opinion, is something to look for with Carolina?
Yeah, I like that Terrace Marshall pick quite a bit. He was a guy that, you know, we at the Fantasy Footballers have been on for a little while, ahead of maybe other, you know, programs, websites, that kind of thing. You just look at like what that offense was at LSU. Like, everyone knows about Jamar Chase. Obviously, everyone knows about Joe Burrow. Everyone talked about Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the running back. Like, Terrace Marshall was producing at a high level on that same offense, and no one talks about him. And then he went out last year and proved with a subpar quarterback, honestly, that he is still a great wide receiver. And he opted out after a few games. Maybe it wasn't quite as fresh in people's mind. He had those injury concerns. I think they're overblowing. You know, he had a history of a fracture with dislocation of his ankle in high school, forced him to miss his freshman year at LSU. Then he had a stress fracture in the opposite foot. And so, you know, unless there's something in his background that we don't know about, that's, you know, this underlying condition that we'll never know, like, unless you have these guys' medical records, you'll just never know, that predisposes him to fractures. I think it's a little overblown. So I'm excited to see him land with a creative scheme here. And I think he's definitely a guy in Dynasty Leagues people have just kind of forgotten about, because I think when he had that first round hype 2-3 weeks before the draft, and all of a sudden things started to fall apart, people kind of forgot about how good he is. So I'm with you on Terrace Marshall for sure. And then I think, you know, the other one that I can't quit this guy. It's DJ Moore. I love him as a player. He's a guy who has first round NFL draft capital from a few years ago. He's a guy who's, we've seen him have the upside that we're looking for in fantasy. But when you look at the advanced data in terms of targets and air yards, he's there, but the quarterback play has just really not been there to support him. Now, is it going to happen with Sam Darnold? I have no idea, but he's a player that there's still a lot of underlying metrics that support. Like, if the right situation develops for him, he could absolutely smash at his 4th round ADP right now. So he's a guy that I'm pretty highly invested in a lot of best ball leagues right now that I'm really excited about, DJ Moore.
Well, I took Sam Darnold for a second at the back end of last year, so I'm hoping that he does do. But how do you, like, is there moving away from Carolina just a little bit? I mean, is there any specific player that you feel is kind of like being overlooked for fantasy and someone that we, you know, should be going out and getting in our drafts?
So the first name that comes to mind off the cuff, and this may change in a heartbeat, is Russell Gage, wide receiver for the Falcons. And it's not because I think he's even really that good. I think he's fine. You know, he's the guy that's going to be the beneficiary of volume there in Atlanta. But behind Calvin Ridley, there is no one to catch the football. Of course, Kyle Pitts, the rookie. But we don't know how he's going to be used. Is he going to be inline tight end? Is he going to be out wide on the perimeter in the slot? We don't know. Calvin Ridley is literally going to be an every down. Not Calvin Ridley. Obviously, he is going to be great. Russell Gage is going to be an every down player for this Falcons team. You're getting him for free right now. You know, if you're drafting really early, if you're doing best ball drafts, his ADP is going to skyrocket probably in the next week when Julio is traded. So he's a player I've been looking to scoop up as a late round value pick that, you know, he's kind of in that sleeper territory for now. But again, that could change literally any day now once Julio's out.
You said you were a Penn State fan. It's starting to sound like you're an LSU fan here. Just recommending all the LSU receivers.
Apparently, yeah, I guess so.
we have a term in the UK called "we wouldn't touch something with a barge pole," which means we don't want anything to do with it. Is there any player in fantasy football that you want nothing to do with, and yet everyone else seems to love, and you just don't get it with them?
Let's stick with the Falcons. I'm gonna go with Mike Davis. And listen, I get that the depth chart on that team does not look great. I also understand that if Julio leaves, there could be targets for Mike Davis. So this could sound like a really silly take in, 5, 6, 7 months. But for me, this is a player who literally has not done anything in the NFL as a sustainable level for fantasy outside of last year, and it took injury to put him in this position. He's 28 years old. You don't see running backs in the NFL that aren't elite producing at a high level. And if you're taking, Mike Davis, presumably by the time summer comes and goes, the 3rd round, maybe he'll get into the 2nd round. I don't know. But at worst, the 4th round of drafts, like I'm not passing on wide receivers like Terry McLaurin, Calvin Ridley, if he's still there. Talked about DJ Moore, other guys that are just high value wide receivers. Just too much opportunity cost for me. So Mike Davis to me is a fade right now. That could sound silly because the depth chart behind him is not scary at all. He's going to get the work apparently. But we've seen running backs fail there, most notably Todd Gurley last year.
I think it's probably good for you to be on a Carolina episode and be talking bad about a team that's in there. That
was well planned.
There's got to be some synergy here, a little bit with the NFC, with the NFC South.
just quickly, I did want to ask you, as you are the fantasy physiotherapist, is there any worries at all about Christian McCaffrey and his comeback?
No, I have pretty high confidence in Christian McCaffrey. Primarily because, looking at his injuries and what happened last year, there's no real correlation. The thing that I always preach to folks is just, you need to be worried about the injuries that happen over and over and over again. A lot, your hamstring issues, your recurring knee issues, like with Todd Gurley, for example, et cetera. Looking at Christian McCaffrey, he had an AC joint injury, a quad strain, and a high ankle sprain. There's no correlation between those sort of things. So when you have a high ankle sprain in season, we see this year after year, especially with running backs and wide receivers. It's very unlikely that player is going to return to form in season, even if they rehab it for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, whatever the team has them do. It's just unlikely. But now with the full offseason to heal, injuries that aren't really correlated, I have pretty high confidence in Christian McCaffrey because when you look at his history before last year, it was pretty clean and he touched the ball a ton. So yeah, for me, no reserves. I'm taking Christian McCaffrey first overall if I have the first draft pick.
Is there anyone that we should be worried about?
Oh, I think so. Not one that I would say worried about. I think one that I would say temper expectations is 2 guys that come to mind. Joe Burrow. We're back on LSU. Joe Burrow is a guy that there's a lot of news recently this week. He was throwing at OTAs, wearing a brace. They're saying he's ready for week 1. And people are just sort of taking it as fact. It's June 1st. Like, we don't know how his summer is going to go. So I would say, let's just see what happens because his injury wasn't a straightforward ACL tear. It had ACL, MCL, and then you hear this in quotes or you'll see it written like additional damage. We don't know what that means. Probably a meniscus, probably cartilage, probably a combination of the two. We don't really know. But regardless, we know that if there is meniscus injury, it takes longer for that player to kind of return to form because the rehab is slower, the progress is slower, and all those sort of things. So while I do think Joe Burrow can be ready for week 1, I just don't think we see Joe Burrow that we saw in week 7 last year step on the field in week 1, and everyone's taking that as fact. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how his summer goes. I'm rooting for him because I like him as a player, but we'll see. The other one that I'm kind of cautioning people with is Raheem Mostert. Again, veteran running back who has a significant history of ankle injuries. He hasn't played 16 games except for once in his entire career. And now we're looking at a situation where there was the injury to Jeff Wilson just last week with the meniscus injury. People automatically started propping up Trey Sermon and Raheem Mostert being like, this is it. This is your opportunity. So if your listeners or your viewers play in dynasty leagues, this to me is the perfect opportunity to get out from Raheem Mostert, who is not under contract next year. He's an older running back. He's got a history of injuries that I'm just saying at this point, if I can get out from him in dynasty, I'm making that move.
Well, you've heard it here first. Sell all your stocks in Raheem Mostert. Any of the Russell Gage, go get Russell Gage. Don't get Mike Davis. And if you have any LSU players, then Matthew Betz is going to be totally on your side and loving your fantasy team. Matthew, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. You've been fantastic. Where can we find all your stuff on social media and your podcasts and articles and stuff that you do?
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much for having me on. This was a ton of fun. Hopefully we can do it again in the future. You all can find me on Twitter at @TheFantasyPT. And then you can find all my work with the fantasy footballers on their website. The Ultimate Draft Kit just launched today, so find my full injury write-ups in there, as well as some DFS content as the season gets closer. And then you can find me on the podcast as well, the Fantasy Footballers DFS podcast.
Smashing. Well, thank you again for coming on, Matthew. Adam, Andrew, thank you for joining me again. Hope you've all enjoyed the video. Remember to subscribe and like the videos. Tell all your NFL UK fans, AUS fans, friends, all about us. We're here to stay. We're here to carry on YouTube and on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So we'll see you all very, very soon.